My name is Ted Grantham. I'm a cooperative extension specialist in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. I'm also one of the co-directors of the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley. Today, I'm going to be talking about cannabis water use in Northern California. And before I get started with this brief presentation, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on this work, Chris Dillis, who led much of the analysis that I'll be presenting today. One of the major concerns over the environmental impacts of cannabis is how water use by cannabis is going to affect in-stream flows for sensitive ecological resources and species that we're trying to protect, like salmon and other sensitive species. We know from enforcement efforts in the past that cannabis water users rely on in-stream diversions such are depicted here in this slide. Here we see on the left a illegal water diversion that's pumping water directly from a stream, and this diesel generator is perched precariously above the stream bank. And in the slide to the right, we see a stream that's been ponded and lined with plastic to create a pond for diverting water. And these types of impacts really raise concerns over how cannabis water users are taking water from the environment and what this means for our sensitive species and resources. We also know that water storage is proliferating across the landscape in cannabis growing regions. We're seeing these external water storage tanks and upland storage systems, such as shown on the right slide here. But to date, our information about cannabis water use has largely been anecdotal, obtained through enforcement efforts and site visits. And for the first time, we're now able to answer some key questions with new data that's emerging from some of the state permitting programs. These key questions include: where do cannabis farms actually source their water? Where are they obtaining water from the environment? How much water is actually being used? And we're really getting new insights on what the potential impacts to in-stream flows are from cannabis water use. So today I'm going to review the insights that we've gained on these really fundamental questions that to this date have not been easily answered, owing to the historical illicit nature of this crop. And these data that we rely upon are self-reporting water use data that's emerged from the Cannabis Water Discharge Regulatory Program in the North Coast region of California. These data are from the first full cultivation season of the program. This was in the year of 2017. So this is actually before most of the new state permitting regulations went into effect. The data that we were able to obtain from these reports include the size of the cultivation area, the type of the cultivation, whether that's outdoor or indoor in hoop houses, for example. We also gain information on monthly volumes of water that are either input to storage or applied directly to plants. And finally, we get some information about the storage types and capacity on site. So the results that I'll be showing today rely really on an analysis of about 1,000 of these reports obtained for the 2017 growing season. We actually obtained a lot more reports than that, but we screened them for quality and ended up with this restricted set of 901 sites, mostly concentrated in Humboldt, Trinity, and Mendocino County, with a few records in Sonoma. So our first key question: where do cannabis farms source their water? Now, cannabis water users are largely located in these very rural, remote watersheds and might be obtaining water from a variety of sources, including surface water sources such as streams and springs, which may sort of vary seasonally in the amount of water available. Or they may rely on more perennial sources like groundwater that could be extracted either from inland wells, such as shown on the right, or from wells right along the riparian or stream corridor, such as shown on the left. Now, when we look at these reports, what the results have shown is that the vast majority of water users in the region, over 50%, nearly 60%, are relying on well water. And this was information that before these reports came out was not well understood. It was largely assumed that these water users were largely relying on surface water sources. So let me just take a minute to walk you through this graph. Basically what we see here is that in the gray bars, it's all of the records combined. And what we see is that overall, nearly 60% of cannabis users in the region reported to this program rely on wells. Somewhere around 15 to 20% of those users also rely on either surface water or spring water. Slightly lower fraction rely on rainwater catchments. And a very small number of users actually rely exclusively or in part on off-site water sources. And these could include municipal water deliveries or municipal water deliveries from off-site sources or potentially direct tie-ins to municipal sources. So our key finding really from this initial analysis was that first, we observed a widespread use of subsurface water throughout the North Coast. And but we also noticed that nearly 40% overall of users do continue to rely on surface and spring water, and this is important because these types of water uses, water being taken from these sources, are subject to new forbearance requirements that were established in 2019. And what I mean by that is that any cannabis cultivator who's interested in entering the legal permitted market that relies on these spring or surface water sources are now required to forbear or are prevented from taking any water during the summer dry season. So basically, they have to provide enough storage on site to collect water in the winter to meet their irrigation needs, or they need to drill a well. So I'll come back to that point a little bit later, but just wanted to highlight this finding here. And if you want to dig a little bit deeper into these specific results on water sourcing, I can direct you to this paper that was published in 2019 in California Agriculture. So the next question, how much water is actually being used by cannabis? There has been some previous work trying to address this question, and basically through interviews with grower associations, a number that was developed was this idea that plants are generally using about 6 gallons per plant per day over the growing season. And this plant-based estimate of water use has been applied in a few different contexts, and one was the study here shown on the right, where they looked at cannabis farms in different watersheds in the North Coast region and used this plant-based estimate to generate basically a water budget to estimate total cannabis water demands in relation to available stream flow. However, there are a few limitations of this approach. First, we know that cannabis is grown in different ways, right? We have outdoor plants that tend to be quite large, such as we see in the upper right-hand corner, and we also have cannabis plants that are grown in these hoop houses or covered areas where the plant density is much higher and the plants themselves are much smaller. And so we really can't compare the plant-based use of these two cultivation types. Second, we can expect that there's going to be a seasonality of water demand. In previous approaches, they've basically used the gallons per plant estimate and applied it to across the entire growing season from March until October. And we can expect that plant water demands are actually going to ramp up as they get bigger and as the season progresses, and probably peak in the late summer. Finally, these plant-based approaches are limited in the way that we can interpret the data in relation to stream flow, because this really assumes that the water that's being applied to plants are being taken on demand from the environment rather than using water storage. So a really important point here is that there's a difference between plant water demand or water use and water extraction. So in this case, water use is just the total amount of water applied from either natural sources or storage directly to the plants to grow these plants. And it really reflects the plant water demand in the growing season. And this has really been what's been used previously to think about potential environmental impacts of cannabis water use. In contrast, water extraction is probably a more reliable way of thinking about environmental impacts. And this really represents the sum of water taken from the environment and either directly applied to plants or diverted into storage. So it really reflects the total amount of water and the timing of water withdrawn from the environment. And this way of thinking about water use is probably more ecologically relevant when thinking about potential impacts to salmon and other sensitive species. So further analysis of this data have shown that the source of water, which I've shown can vary quite substantially depending on where they're located and every farm, has a huge influence on the timing of water extraction. And here we just see a really notable example where if cannabis farms are relying on rainwater catchment, their patterns of extraction are going to be entirely in the winter wet seasons. In other words, their water, the timing of water use is going to be taken, concentrated in November to April. Whereas we see that farms that rely primarily on groundwater or well water pump primarily on demand. In other words, they're not pumping from the wells into storage, but rather they're taking that water from wells and applying it directly to plants as they need it. And so in this case, if they're relying on wells, the demands largely reflect really the plant water demand in the growing season. With farmers relying on both surface and spring water sources, we see a more steady demand across the growing season, where we see perhaps some peak in the growing season months, but the timing of withdrawals is actually much more consistent. And this is really explained by the role of storage that I mentioned earlier. And in particular, it appears that growers that rely on seasonal water sources like springs and surface water sources like streams often use storage, such as like the pond shown here, or these above ground water storage tanks, to augment their irrigation supplies in the dry growing season. And so we took all these data and we developed a model to try to understand how the access to different water sources and or the presence of water storage actually affects these seasonal water extraction patterns. So let me take a minute to walk you through this slide. What this shows is the seasonal extraction profiles of different classes of water users. In the yellow-orange color, those are water users that rely on perennial water sources like groundwater. And as I showed earlier, this pattern of demand largely reflects cannabis, the plant water demand itself. And so it really tracks the growing season. In contrast, the blue line here represents cultivators that have access to a pond on site and are able to store large quantities of water in the wet season. And so here we basically see the exact opposite pattern, where all of the vast majority of water is being extracted in the winter months, and very little water, relatively little water, is being extracted in the growing season. And we see that other users that rely on seasonal sources but don't have access to large storage like a pond have that sort of steady water use profile across the season. Just one note here is that these graphs represent the estimated use for the median farm size in the area, which is about 1/4 of an acre. So those demand volumes that you see on the y-axis are relative to the median farm size. You also see in light gray here a line that shows the plant-based estimate of total demand. So that's the basically 6 gallons per plant per day. And what we see is that for groundwater users, the amount of water being applied to farms pretty much matches that amount in the peak of the dry season. But at the beginning of the growing season and the end of the growing season, total water demand is actually much less. So this sort of plant-based approach that's been used previously is perhaps not is pretty reflective of peak season water demands, but may not be as good an indicator or estimate of demands in the early or late season. So coming back to this question of water storage and some of the policy implications of this work. As I mentioned earlier, farms that rely on seasonal water sources, surface water sources like streams and springs, are under the new permitting system, are no longer able to take any water from those sources between April and October. In other words, they either have to store the water they need in the wet season or drill wells. And based on our analysis of these data, we see that those farms that rely on these seasonal water sources, most of them, or the majority of them, do not have sufficient storage to meet that requirement. And so this suggests to me that in the future, we can either expect to see increasing well drilling to allow them to continue to meet their water demands and meet the permitting requirements, or potentially the expansion of water storage if they're able to on their site.